The classroom buzzes with chatter as the liberal professor confidently strides to the front, ready to make his point. Barron Trump, sitting quietly in the back, watches, his expression unreadable. The professor begins. Now, let's talk about the political figures shaping our nation. First, Melania Trump. She's hardly more than a trophy wife, right? Laughter erupts from some of the students in the room. But Barron's eyes don't leave the professor. There's a tense silence as the professor continues. I mean, come on. Her be best initiative? It was a joke. It's almost laughable that she tried to step into a role of influence at all. The room quiets, awaiting Barron's reaction. He shifts in his seat, the weight of the words hanging in the air. With calm precision, he stands up, his voice cutting through the quiet. You know, my mom may not be perfect in your eyes, he begins, but she did more than most people could ever dream of. The professor smirks, clearly underestimating him. Oh, really? And what exactly has she done? Barron's gaze sharpens. She's been a role model for millions of women, working tirelessly for causes that matter. But instead of being proud of her achievements, you mock her in front of me, in front of all of us. That's what matters, right? Standing up for your beliefs. The professor's smile falters. The students, who were once eager to hear the professor's take, now sit in stunned silence. Barron steps closer. My mom might not be a politician or a public speaker, but she's done something far more important. She's raised me, taught me how to stand tall in the face of ridicule, how to be strong. For a moment, the room is frozen. The professor stands speechless, unable to respond. Barron turns, his words ringing out with an unexpected power. Maybe it's time to stop mocking people you don't understand. It's easy to throw stones when you're safe in your own bubble. But if you ever had to walk a day in her shoes, you'd see the strength you're missing. Barron walks out of the room, leaving a trail of silence in his wake. The professor stands still, his thoughts lost. No one moves. As Barron walked out of the classroom, his footsteps echoed down the long corridor, and the murmur of voices behind him slowly grew louder. The professor stood frozen, still grappling with Barron's words, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Students shifted in their seats, glancing at one another as the tension in the room slowly dissolved into awkward silence. The professor, who had always prided himself on his sharp wit and ability to outsmart his students, was stunned into silence. Never before had anyone stood up to him so directly, so boldly, especially not a teenager. One student, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, raised a hand. Professor, she said cautiously, maybe you went a little too far this time. The professor snapped out of his daze, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? He replied, though the challenge in his voice was softer than usual. I mean, Barron's right, she said. You made a joke about his mom, but you don't know what it's like for him. You don't know what it's like to walk in his shoes. The professor's face flushed, but he didn't respond immediately. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but closed it again. He was finding it difficult to gather his thoughts. The student's words lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, students began gathering their things. The buzz of conversation was hushed at first, but soon, it became impossible to ignore. Whispers of what had just happened filled the room. Some students were still processing the unexpected turn of events, while others were eager to discuss it. But all shared a sense of awe at Barron's maturity and composure. Meanwhile, Barron didn't stop walking. His mind was sharp, but his heart was heavy. He had never liked being in the spotlight, never sought it out. But what had just happened in that classroom? Something in that moment had clicked. Something had shifted inside him. He stepped outside the building, breathing in the cool air. The world seemed quieter here, away from the chaos and noise of the campus. He walked slowly, his mind racing as he reflected on the confrontation. His mother, Melania Trump, had always told him that strength wasn't about shouting the loudest or winning every battle. It was about standing firm in your beliefs and letting your actions speak for themselves. Barron had been taught to handle criticism with grace, to rise above petty insults. He had been raised with the knowledge that not everyone would understand him, his family, or their choices. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the truth. And Barron knew the truth about his mother. He knew what she had done. Her quiet dedication to causes that mattered, her unwavering commitment to her family, her work as First Lady, and her strength in the face of relentless scrutiny. What Barron had said in that classroom wasn't just a defense of his mother. It was a defense of all the people who had been underestimated, misunderstood, or criticized. It was a reminder that words had power, but they also had consequences. The professor had chosen to mock Melania Trump, but Barron had chosen to stand up for her. And in doing so, he had not only stood up for his mother, but for every person who had ever been unfairly judged. As Barron made his way to the car, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had found his voice. Later that evening, Barron sat in the living room of his family's home, quietly reading a book. The soft light of the fireplace flickered in the background, and the sound of his mother's voice echoed from the kitchen as she prepared dinner. He had thought about telling her about the incident at school, but part of him didn't want to burden her with it. She had enough on her plate already. But as he sat there, something in him told him that this was a moment he needed to share, not for his own sake, but for hers. Barron stood up and walked to the kitchen, where Melania was carefully slicing vegetables. She looked up at him with a warm smile. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. Barron hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It was interesting," he said. Melania raised an eyebrow. "Interesting? In a good way or a bad way?" Barron took a deep breath and sat down at the kitchen table. "Today, a professor mocked you in front of the class," he said quietly. Melania's expression softened. She didn't look surprised. She had dealt with her fair share of public criticism over the years, but hearing that someone had targeted her son hit differently. "Why?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of concern. Barron shrugged. "I don't know. He made fun of your work, your initiatives, like it was some kind of joke. But he paused, searching for the right words. "I couldn't let it slide. I had to say something. I had to stand up for you." Melania put down the knife and walked over to him, her eyes searching his face. "And what did you say?" Barron smiled faintly. "I told him that you were more than just a first lady. I told him you've done more for others than he could ever imagine. And I told him that maybe if he took a moment to walk in your shoes, he'd see things differently." Melania's eyes filled with pride. "Barron, you're right," she said softly. "You always know what to say when it matters. I'm proud of you." For the first time that day, Barron felt the weight of the situation lift. In his mother's eyes, he saw nothing but love and understanding. She didn't need to say anything else. Barron knew that he had done the right thing. The next day at school, Barron walked through the halls with a sense of newfound confidence. He knew the professor would likely try to brush off the incident, but he also knew that he had left a mark, one that would be hard to forget. As he entered the classroom, the professor looked up from his desk. He didn't smile or acknowledge Barron, but there was a certain weight in the air between them. The students, who had been curious about what would happen next, glanced at Barron with quiet respect. It was clear that the dynamic in the classroom had shifted. Barron had taken a stand, and the ripple effect was already being felt. The professor, once untouchable in his own mind, was no longer the only voice that mattered. And as Barron sat down in his seat, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the world would start listening. Barron settled into his seat, his mind swirling with thoughts about the day before. The professor hadn't acknowledged him as he entered, but Barron could feel the tension in the air. The other students, who had witnessed the confrontation, were now looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Some even gave him subtle nods of approval, and Barron could feel their silent support. The bell rang, and the professor began his lecture, though his usual confident, almost condescending tone was noticeably absent. Instead, he seemed distracted, his words falling flat, as if he were running on autopilot. Barron didn't care to pay attention to the lecture. His thoughts kept drifting back to the previous day. Why had the professor decided to target his mother? Was it a calculated attempt to rile him up, or was it just another instance of political mockery he had become so accustomed to seeing? Regardless, Barron had never been one to let personal attacks slide. He had learned early in life that silence could sometimes be interpreted as weakness, and he refused to let that happen. As the class continued, Barron couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something else was at play. The professor's attack on his mother felt more personal than political. But why? Melania Trump, for all her public presence, had rarely been the subject of such personal critiques in Barron's life. She was often criticized for her position, yes, but this felt different. The words the professor had used were more venomous than anything Barron had heard before. After the class ended, Barron gathered his things slowly, taking his time as the other students filed out of the room. A couple of them whispered among themselves, but Barron didn't pay them any mind. He was in no rush. The quiet hum of the classroom seemed to stretch on, as if waiting for him to make the next move. As he walked out of the classroom, Barron was greeted by a couple of friends from other classes. They had seen the confrontation, and their expressions were a mixture of respect and surprise. One of them, a tall, athletic boy named Sam, clapped him on the back. "Man, you really gave it to that professor yesterday. I thought for sure he was going to rip you apart, but you were solid," Sam said with a grin. Barron shrugged, the memory of the confrontation still fresh in his mind. "I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time." The three friends walked together to the cafeteria, chatting about the usual things. But the conversation kept circling back to what had happened in class. Barron wasn't sure what to make of it all. He had defended his mother, yes, but there was more to it than that. The words he had spoken in that classroom had come from a deeper place within him, something that had been simmering for a while, waiting for the right moment to break free. Over the next few days, Barron noticed a subtle shift in how people interacted with him. The students who had once kept their distance now seemed more inclined to talk to him. Some even approached him with questions about what had happened in the classroom. Barron wasn't sure what they expected him to say, but he didn't mind the attention. It was as though the professor's mockery had somehow made him stand out in a way he hadn't before. But Barron wasn't interested in the spotlight. He wasn't doing this for recognition or fame. He had stood up because it felt right, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon, as Barron sat alone in the library, scrolling through his phone, he received a message from his mother. The notification was simple, just a text with a heart emoji. But the message behind it was clear. She was proud of him. Barron smiled, a small wave of warmth flooding over him. He had always admired his mother's resilience, her ability to keep moving forward no matter the challenges in her path. She had taught him that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Later that evening, Barron sat at the dinner table with his parents. Melania's presence was calm, serene even, despite the ongoing political turmoil that surrounded their family. She asked about his day, and Barron told her, though he left out the details of the confrontation in class. "I'm proud of you, Barron," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've always known what's important. You're stronger than you think." Barron looked at his mother, seeing her not as the former First Lady, but as the woman who had raised him with love and strength. He didn't need her approval, but hearing those words from her meant more than anything. The days passed, and the professor's treatment of Barron became more subdued. It was clear that the classroom dynamic had shifted. Barron wasn't sure if the professor had learned anything from their encounter, but it seemed that his attempt to humiliate Barron had backfired. The students, who had once looked up to the professor for his sharp wit and liberal views, were now questioning his methods. It wasn't just Barron who had been affected. It was the entire class. The next week, Barron found himself walking into class again, the professor standing at the front as usual. But this time, there was a different air about him. The usual smirk was gone, replaced by a more neutral expression. The class began, and the professor seemed more focused than ever, avoiding any personal remarks. Barron didn't feel any sense of victory, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had made his point. He wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how influential they were, mock his family. He would speak up when necessary, but he would also do so with the knowledge that standing up for the truth was always the right thing to do. A few days later, Barron received an unexpected email. It was from the professor. The subject line simply read, "A note of apology." Barron hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The email began with an acknowledgement of the incident, with the professor stating that he regretted the way he had approached the subject and the comments he had made. He went on to say that, while they may not agree politically, he respected Barron's ability to stand up for his beliefs. Barron read the email twice, letting the words sink in. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was a recognition of the power of dialogue and differing opinions. The professor had made a point of saying that he valued open discussion, and in some ways, this message was his attempt to do just that. Barron thought for a moment before responding. He didn't need to accept the apology. He didn't even need to respond at all. But something about the gesture felt right. He typed a brief reply. "Thank you for your message. I appreciate the recognition." That was all. He hit send and closed his laptop. In the end, Barron realized that the most important thing was not the conflict itself, but the growth that had come from it. He had learned more about himself, about his values, and about how powerful it could be to stand up for what was right, whether it was in a classroom, on a public stage, or in the privacy of his own home. Barron knew that he could always count on his ability to speak his truth. And with that, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, it's not the big battles that matter most, but the quiet moments when you choose to rise above. The weeks passed, and Barron found that life at school had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The professor's attempted mockery seemed to have faded into the background, overshadowed by the underlying tension that still simmered within him. It wasn't just the class that had changed. Barron himself had changed. He no longer felt the need to hide behind the anonymity of his family name, but instead, he embraced who he was as an individual, a young man with his own values and beliefs, no longer defined by what others expected of him. The incident with the professor had sparked a chain reaction within Barron. It was as if something had been unlocked within him, a fire that had always been there but had been hidden under layers of expectation and caution. He found himself looking at things differently, questioning the world in a way he hadn't before. The thought of standing up for his beliefs, especially in a world that often seemed divided, was both daunting and empowering. Barron began to take his classes more seriously, throwing himself into his studies with a new sense of purpose. His once unremarkable academic performance had begun to shift as he realized that learning was a tool, not just for grades or accolades, but for shaping the way he saw the world. His friends noticed the change. They commented on how he had become more confident, how he now carried himself with an air of determination that had been missing before. "I don't know what happened, man," Sam said one day as they sat in the cafeteria. "You just seem different, like you've grown up in the past couple of weeks." Barron shrugged. "I guess sometimes things just happen that make you see things differently. I'm just figuring out what's important." Sam nodded, as though that made perfect sense. "Whatever it is, I like it. You've got this quiet confidence now. It's not about showing off, but it's there." Barron didn't respond right away. His mind was still churning, thinking about the professor, about everything that had happened, and about his own journey. He had learned to defend his family, but there was something deeper at play. It was about standing up for himself, not just for others, but for who he was becoming. A few days after the professor's apology email, Barron received another message, this time from a classmate, Sarah. She had been one of the quieter students in the class, often sitting near the back and keeping to herself. Barron didn't know her very well, but there was something about her that had always intrigued him. The subject line of the email was simple, "Can we talk?" Barron opened it, reading the short message inside. "I just wanted to say that what you did in class really stood out to me. I've always been quiet about my own beliefs, but you gave me the courage to speak up for what I think. I don't know if you're interested in talking about it, but I'd like to." Barron sat for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't expected to be an inspiration to anyone. He had simply acted in the heat of the moment. But now he saw that his words had affected someone else. He decided to respond. "Sure, I'd be happy to talk. When's a good time for you?" The next day, after class, Barron and Sarah met in the library. She was a petite girl, with glasses perched on the tip of her nose and a quiet demeanor that contrasted Barron's more reserved personality. They found a secluded corner of the library and sat across from each other, the only sound being the soft rustle of pages turning and the distant hum of students talking. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did," Sarah began, her voice soft but steady. You made me realize that it's okay to have a voice, even when you feel like no one will listen. Barron nodded. I didn't think about it like that at the time. I wasn't going to let someone disrespect my family. But if it helped you in some way, I'm glad. I've always kept my opinions to myself, she continued. I'm not really political, but the way you handled that situation made me realize I don't have to be afraid of standing up for myself. It's hard, though. People judge so quickly. But I guess, after seeing you, I feel like maybe I can do it too. Barron could sense the sincerity in her words, and for the first time, he felt like his actions had meant something beyond just his immediate response. He had helped someone else find their voice. In that moment, Barron realized that standing up for what was right wasn't just about defending others. It was about empowering people to find their own strength. I get it, Barron said, leaning forward slightly. It's scary, but sometimes you have to take that first step, even if it feels uncomfortable. It's all part of growing. Sarah smiled, her eyes lighting up with gratitude. Thank you, Barron. I'll keep that in mind. The conversation lingered for a while longer, and as they talked, Barron found himself more and more comfortable with the idea of connecting with others who shared his values. It was a subtle shift, but it felt significant. He wasn't just a student trying to get through his classes anymore. He was someone who could make a difference, even in small ways. A few days later, Barron received an unexpected invitation from the professor. This time, the subject line read, "A new discussion." Barron hesitated. He wasn't sure what to expect. The professor's previous message had been polite, but he had no idea what the man might want now. Still, Barron decided to reply. "What's this about?" The professor's reply was short. "I'd like to meet with you and discuss a potential project. Please let me know if you're interested." Barron felt a knot form in his stomach. The idea of meeting with the professor again, after their tense encounter, felt uncomfortable. But he couldn't ignore the opportunity. He needed to know what the professor wanted from him. The following afternoon, Barron found himself sitting in the professor's office. The door closed behind him. The professor was seated at his desk, flipping through papers. But he looked up as Barron entered. "Ah, Barron. Thank you for coming," the professor said, his tone more neutral than it had been in their previous interactions. "Please sit down." Barron took a seat, folding his hands in his lap. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he remained calm, determined to face whatever came next. "I wanted to speak with you about the recent incident in class," the professor began. "I've had some time to reflect, and I must admit that I was out of line. What I said about your mother was inappropriate. You responded in a way that I hadn't anticipated. It made me think about how I approach discussions in this classroom, and I'd like to apologize again for the way I handled it." Barron listened quietly, waiting for the professor to continue. "However," the professor added, "I don't want to make this all about the past. I believe that you have a unique perspective. You've shown a certain level of maturity and poise that I think could be beneficial for a new project I'm working on. It involves exploring differing political viewpoints in a respectful, open-minded way. I believe that you could contribute something valuable to the project." Barron raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "What kind of project are you talking about?" The professor smiled faintly. "It's a series of discussions where students present their views on various political and social issues, but with the goal of fostering respectful dialogue, even when there are strong disagreements. I think you'd be a perfect fit for it, given your ability to stay calm under pressure." Barron considered the offer. It was unexpected, but it wasn't the kind of project he had imagined himself being involved in. However, something about the idea of creating a space for meaningful conversation resonated with him. Perhaps this was his opportunity to put his newfound confidence to work, not just for himself, but for others who might be too afraid to speak out. "I'll think about it," Barron said after a moment. The professor nodded. "Take your time. This is about creating a space for people to grow and learn from each other, even if they don't agree. It could be a challenging but rewarding experience." Barron left the professor's office feeling uncertain but hopeful. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he was on the right path. No longer defined by his family's legacy or others' expectations, Barron was finding his own way forward. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but Barron was ready. He had learned that sometimes, standing up for what was right wasn't about seeking approval. It was about trusting in your own voice.